Morning, everyone. Welcome to Grand Rounds. Next week, we will have the Eric Hadar Distinguished Lecture in Psychiatry of Substance Use Disorders, and it'll be given by Dr. Kathleen Carroll from Yale, who is going to be speaking on the adventures in the dissemination of evidence-based therapies. Fran Levin's hosting her. And I just mentioned that Eric Hadar, who is a donor to the department and specifically to the Substance Abuse Division, was a grateful patient of the late Herb Kleber's. And so, Herb's good services, brought his largesse to the department. And, this lecture, which is named for Mr. Hadar, is, equally in the honor of Herb. Well, it's a pleasure to have today Dr. Lawrence Palinkas with us as a speaker. Oh, an announcement. Dan Shalev. Dan, are you here? He's playing hooky when he has his moment of fame. So Dan was selected as by the American College of Psychiatrists as a Laughlin Fellow. So this is kind of a prestigious award that's been going on for many, many years that the ACP sponsors to essentially give a person, a trainee, a year to sort of hobnob with the leaders in the field and, have some career mentoring in terms of leadership in academic psychiatry. So congratulations to Dan. So today it's nice to have Dr. Lawrence Palinkas with us. Dr. Palinkas is from the West Coast, from California, Southern California, and he really did most of his. Are you originally from the Midwest?
Originally from Canada.
Canada.
Ontario.
Where?
Hamilton, Ontario.
Hamilton, Ontario. I didn't pick that up from your accent. If you would, but
Well, that was 50 years.
well, you don't talk like a Southern Californian either. But Dr. Palinkas is a graduate of the University of Chicago, where he received his a BA in anthropology, and then he moved west and he received his PhD in anthropology at UCSD, and was on faculty there for many years before, in 2005, being recruited to the University of Southern California, where he currently is on the faculty and holds a variety of titles, including the Albert and Francis Lomas Feldman Professor of Social Policy and Health Professor of Social Work. He's also the chair of the Department of Children, Youth, Families in the Susan Peck School of Social Work at USC. And particularly impressive title is that he's a fellow in the Arnold Schwarzenegger Institute for State and Global Policy. Do you have to do like bodybuilding to become a fellow? But Dr. Palinkas' work has really been prolific and extensive and impactful, without going into it in detail, to say that his focus and research-wise has been in behavioral health, global health, and health disparities, implementation science, community-based participatory research, and the social, cultural, and environmental determinants of health and health-related behavior, with a focus on disease prevention and health promotion. So I appreciate your journeying out here and spending the day with us. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Lawrence Palinkas.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to come and talk to you today. I have to say that I am so gratified to see so many faces out in the crowd today. Last week, I was asked to give a presentation to a group of undergraduates at USC as part of the Mental Health Awareness Month. And, as you know, it's a very stressful time for college students these days, particularly with all of the threats that are coming both visibly in the form of school shootings, as well as through national leaders, pundits who talk about how undergraduates are being coddled on the one hand, but fail to understand the kinds of pressures that they're under on the other hand. Yet when I went to give the presentation, there were only 6 people in the audience, and 2 of them were there to take pictures of the event. And so the intention, it was part of a panel. There was another panelist there, and the intention was to talk about how people get involved in doing research on mental health. And as I explained to them, my research trajectory has included both understanding the causes of mental health problems and behavioral health problems, and then more recently, the challenges involved in implementing solutions to those problems. Curiously, or perhaps not so curiously, the undergraduates weren't particularly interested in the topic of implementation, but they were interested in learning more about the factors that contribute to the experience of PTSD, of depression, of anxiety, the kinds of things that they are particularly concerned about and dealing with. And it made perfect sense to me because they're looking at, a common problem, but from their perspective as a participant in that problem. And that problem happens to be one that has driven a lot of my research as well, which has to do with the delivery of quality mental health care to children and adolescents. So as you know, particularly those of you who work with kids, it's estimated that about 1 out of every 5 children or youth in the United States today experiences some clinically significant mental health problem before they reach the age of 18. That number varies. Sometimes you see 1 in 4. I've even seen, some of the studies that were done about 10 years ago suggesting that maybe 40%, Ron Kessler and his group estimated that 40% of youth experience a significant mental health problem before they reach the age of 18. Within that population, there are some that are particularly vulnerable to mental health problems. Children who are involved in child welfare systems, for example. Nowadays, there are about 415,000 youth in child welfare in the United States, and that number has actually declined over time. About 10 years ago, it was more like 475 to 500,000. But of those youth, about 50% of them need some form of mental health services. And given the fact that during the past year, as many as 1/4 may experience a mental health problem, 1/3 over their lifetimes, the most common problems being anxiety disorders, followed by behavior disorders like ADHD, depressive disorders, and then substance use. That particular events that occur during childhood make them particularly susceptible. So interpersonal loss, maltreatment, poverty, racism and discrimination, juvenile justice involvement are experiences that increase the likelihood that these kids are going to need some form of services. Over the years, we've done a fabulous job of developing a host of treatments, interventions that are designed to treat these mental health problems and to prevent them. They range from programs that target individual youth through therapies such as cognitive behavioral therapy for depression or anxiety. There are a number of programs that provide behavioral parent training so that many of the problems are dealt with not merely directly with the affected youth, but with their parents who help to participate in the treatment process. Unfortunately, These systems aren't widely used. Despite the fact that we've spent hundreds of millions of dollars in developing, testing, and evaluating, demonstrating their effectiveness, only about 1 in 5 youth get the services that they need. And when you look at publicly funded child welfare, mental health, juvenile justice systems, about 90% of them don't use evidence-based practices as they were intended to be used. In other words, the terminology that we use in implementation is use with fidelity. And in fact, when you look at kids in child welfare, a study that was done in 2010 found that about half of kids in child welfare receive care consistent with any one national standard, and about 10% get care consistent with all 10 national standards for delivering services to child welfare-involved youth. Certainly, child mental health is not alone in experiencing this problem of a gap between research and practice. And in fact, as you probably are aware, the Institute of Medicine back then issued its hallmark report, Crossing the Quality Chasm, where they talked about a widespread problem of failure of healthcare systems to implement evidence-based practices. So it seems that there's a disconnect between all the energy that researchers put into developing wonderful interventions and treatments and their use in routine practice. Now, there are a number of reasons to account for this failure. The fact is that practitioners just have limited time and resources. If you're in primary care and you're seeing a patient every 15 minutes, you really don't have time to engage in any form of psychotherapy for a client who's exhibiting symptoms of depression, for example. Many of the staff, both in healthcare systems and adjunct social service systems, simply don't get the training that they need. And it's not just a matter of having somebody who developed the intervention come and talk to the staff for a couple of days, but ongoing supervision, providing feedback and monitoring is oftentimes missing from these training efforts. The fact that we as researchers spend a lot of time disseminating our work in peer-reviewed journals that simply aren't read by practitioners is a problem because they neither have access to them, and even when they do have access, they don't have the time, the energy, or the interest in reading that material. And many agencies simply don't provide the incentives for using these evidence-based practices as they were intended. There's very little incentive. So in New York State, for example, you may have child mental health clinics that are overseen by the Office of Mental Health in Albany that are very committed to adopting innovative practices, but are financially incapable of rewarding their staff for taking the extra time to use these practices as they were intended. Other problems are the logic and the assumptions that go into the design of efficacy and even effectiveness research trials. So we spend a lot of time making careful decisions about who we recruit to participate in these trials and what the inclusion and exclusion criteria are. Unfortunately, they don't necessarily mirror real-world conditions on the one hand, and even when they do so, they don't necessarily capture many of the challenges that clinicians face in routinely using a particular evidence-based practice in the real world as well. Many of them simply aren't relevant to specific clients or patient populations, so that interventions that are designed for older adults don't necessarily work for kids and vice versa. Settings that such as interpersonal IPT, interpersonal psychotherapy, which work for some populations, don't particularly work for others that feel more comfortable working in one-on-one situations and less so with groups. One of the concerns you often hear from clinicians is the fact that having something that is introduced into the patient-client relationship may disrupt the therapeutic relationship and provide less control over that relationship on the part of the therapist. And sometimes you get resistance and pushback for that. But for the most part, what the literature has devoted a great deal of attention to doing is focusing on the inadequate infrastructure and systems organization that would support the translation of research into practice. Now, in response to this gap, there is a field of study that has emerged called implementation science. And there's a journal called Implementation Science, which in its first issue in 2006, the editors had essentially defined the field as the scientific study of methods to promote the systematic uptake of research findings and other evidence-based practices into routine practice, and hence improving the quality of health and effectiveness of health services. How that gets done is basically organized around 4 pillars. One of those pillars is the development and application of implementation theories, models, and frameworks. There are dozens of them. In fact, I think one recent publication identified over 80 such theories. One of the classic theories, which actually came out of the field of rural sociology, was developed by Everett Rogers, and it's known as the diffusion of innovations theory. And it was really based on his studies of how farmers in Iowa began to adopt the planting of hybrid forms of corn, and how social networks of farmers and the relationship to the local county agricultural expert played a big role in that process of adoption and implementation of new farming techniques. Nowadays, we have a variety of models and theories. We have a lot of frameworks, which essentially are lists of variables that are one way or another associated with the likelihood of successful implementation. One of the more commonly known was developed by Laura Damschroeder and her colleagues, called the Consolidated Framework for Implementation Research, which essentially identifies 5 major domains of constructs that are believed to be associated with implementation. So characteristic of the individuals involved, the organizations to which they belong, the outer setting that creates the supply and demand of resources to support an evidence-based practice, the intervention itself, and the process by which that intervention is introduced into a healthcare system. Another framework which is increasingly becoming more popular is known as the EPIS framework. EPIS standing for Exploration, Adoption, Implementation, and Sustainment. And this was developed by Greg Ahrens and his colleagues, which also took characteristics of the outer context, the inner context, but focused it on various stages of implementation. So the fact is, implementation is a process that occurs in stages, beginning with an agency first becoming exposed to the idea of adopting an innovative practice, to how they prepare their organization to make that adoption happen, to actively and routinely using the practice, to maintaining that practice once the initial efforts and the initial funding has disappeared. And then in Canada, we've had a tradition known as knowledge transfer and exchange models, which have been developed as a way of facilitating the translation of research into practice through a series of defined steps that are designed to facilitate the implementation of evidence-based practice. So that's the first pillar. The second pillar is the strategies that we use to successfully implement a particular practice. And that can come from a variety of different forms. Some of them are structured around the notion of collaboratives, of bringing together different stakeholders to problem solve, to learn more about an innovation, evidence-based practice, and then to figure out the steps necessary to routinely use that practice in their own setting. Institute for Healthcare Improvement, for example, developed what they call the breakthrough series model, where a collaborative goes through a defined series of activities known as plan, do, study, and act, where they learn about an innovative practice, think about how they're going to implement it, try it out, evaluate the initial results, and then make whatever necessary adjustments. Another form was developed by the California Institute of Mental Health, known as the Community Development Team model. This, too, is based on what's called a quality improvement collaborative model, where you bring different stakeholders together to problem solve what is necessary to implement a particular practice, how can we share resources, how can we exchange knowledge to achieve a common goal. Another approach is called cascading dissemination. Many times this is represented in a technique known as training the trainer. So one of the biggest challenges that clinics, organizations face when introducing a new practice is as soon as you train your staff in the practice, eventually they're going to leave. And many times they leave because now they can get a better paying job because they've got this skill set that you've just paid to have them trained in. And so keeping that corporate knowledge, if you will, within a organization is a major issue. And one way of addressing that issue is by having what is known as a seed team, people who are trained in a particular intervention who can then train other staff members and train incoming or new staff members as well. And then there are other interventions which are designed to prepare organizations to adopt innovative practices. Charles Glisson developed one called the ARC model, standing for Availability, Responsiveness, and Continuity, where for a good deal of money, agencies can be trained and assisted by skilled experts in going through a series of stages from collaboration, participation, innovation, all in 12 weeks. And by the end of 12 weeks, they're capable, or theoretically, the organization is capable of successfully implementing a new adoptive practice. And in fact, this has been shown to be effective in producing not only wider spread use of a practice, but improved clinical outcomes in youth who are served by that practice. The third pillar of implementation science is the development of measures to evaluate both the process and outcome of implementation. So one of the more widely used measures of implementation outcomes was developed by Russ Glasgow, who's now at the University of Colorado, formerly at National Cancer Institute, called the RE-AIM model. RE-AIM standing for the reach, how many people benefit from, need and benefit from the intervention, its effectiveness, the adoption, implementation, and then maintenance. Another widely used measure is the stages of implementation completion scale, which looks at the process of implementation beginning from that very first contact with a treatment developer to certification of competency in using a particular intervention, and then assessing all the activities that go into each of these stages. So it assesses the progress that an agency makes when implementing a new practice. And then one that I've been involved in creating through an NIH grant that I have currently is looking at the measurement of sustainment. So once the funding goes away, do these programs continue to exist? Are they sustainable? And in our study, we're looking at programs that are funded by SAMHSA's, Mental Health Services Center, as well as the Center for Substance Use Prevention.
Excuse me, Dr. Palinka?
Yes.
Just to give it a little context. So this is a methodology for, implementing, evidence-based services or models of care. But who's doing it? I mean, this is a body of knowledge, and it can be applied to different types of provider organizations under the auspices of various regulatory or funding aid. I mean, how is this actually put into practice?
So it's done in a variety of ways. Certainly the assessment of implementation it has been used, the measures have been developed by researchers, but these systems are being used to essentially provide feedback to clinicians as to how well they're doing and to identify barriers to implementation. So that SAMHSA is intending to use this measure, SAMHSA is intending to use this as a way for their program officers to provide feedback to their grantees on progress towards sustainability, as well as it's essentially a way of monitoring grantee performance, basically. And the stages of implementation completion is also being used in that manner. In terms of the strategy, so these are ways of preparing agencies, preparing clinicians to implement. Whether it's by bringing them together in community development teams or quality collaboratives, or by training the trainers. These are all techniques for facilitating the implementation of any evidence-based program, policy, or practice. And then finally, what distinguishes implementation science is its innovation in methods. So the area that I have worked with for most of my time in the field has been in the integration of qualitative and quantitative methods. Largely came about through my own academic experience. I was trained as an anthropologist to do ethnographic field work. I realized once I got my degree, if I was going to be employable, I needed to know something about numbers. So I did a postdoctoral fellowship in epidemiology. And it gave me an ability to understand both qualitative and quantitative methods enough so that I could explain to one audience or the other what the other was doing. But in terms of mixed methods, it's now become standard practice for studies of implementation to involve some form of qualitative and quantitative data collection and analysis. But it's not merely a question of parallel play, where you've got the qualitative expert doing their thing and the quantitative expert doing their thing, but how they actually work together to create a synergy of understanding that is greater than what either of them could do independently. System science methods like social network analysis has been increasingly used in the field of implementation science. Innovations in experimental designs has also been increasingly used. As I said, while the randomized controlled trial has been the standard of practice for evaluating effectiveness, the fact is that it raises a number of concerns with respect to external validity. It also raises concerns with agencies and communities who really don't like the fact that half of the people are being randomized to a control condition and don't get the benefit of the experimental effect or likely effect. So there have been a variety of alternative designs. The step wedge design is becoming increasingly popular as a way of engaging everyone, but altering the timing at which they're engaged. And then community-based participatory research is another technique that essentially involves developing partnerships between researchers and practitioners to address issues that are of relevance to the community. So these are the foundations of implementation science. Recently, I had the experience of sort of thinking about this in the context of my own work in the field of implementation science, which has resulted in a publication, a book, that is actually coming out in 2 weeks, called Achieving Implementation and Exchange, hence the title of my talk today. And really, it's an attempt to do something that every implementation scientist is actively discouraged from doing, which is developing yet another model, theory, or framework. As I said, there are currently about 80 of them out there, 80 plus. And one of the biggest challenges is trying to figure out which one should I use. Should I use the consolidated framework for implementation research, diffusion of innovation theory? What makes sense for my particular challenge? And my answer to that question really relies on my own experience in working as an implementation researcher, and in focusing on a particular aspect of the process of implementation, which is if we're talking about the translation of research to practice, that translation should ideally involve some kind of interaction or some kind of relationship. So Enola Proctor, who runs a training program out of Washington University in St. Louis, and her colleagues called for what they referred to as a transactional model, where all stakeholders equally contribute to and gain from collaboration, and where cultural exchange is encouraged. They move beyond the traditional unidirectional models of diffusion. So it's not the agricultural agent who comes up with a new way of growing corn and then teaches all the farmers, but rather an interaction that goes on between researchers, practitioners, and policymakers. And it's the product of that interaction that creates a sustainable intervention. So the model that I'm going to introduce today actually traces its roots in the field of anthropology. My mentor was a British social anthropologist by the name of Freddie Bailey. And Frederick Barth, another famous Norwegian anthropologist, developed a notion of social change as being a result of transactions between different stakeholders. In the case of child mental health and child welfare, that transaction seems to involve 5 different components. The first being social networks and collaborations, the second being the use of research evidence, the third being the integration of what I call global and local models of evidence and implementation. The fourth being research practice policy partnerships. And then finally, the cultural exchanges that occur among the stakeholders involved in implementation efforts. These components are illustrated in 4 major studies that I've led over the last decade. The first being a study of the implementation of an evidence-based practice known as treatment foster care Oregon in California and Ohio. And I'll tell you a little bit about that. The second, a study that was actually done both in California as well as in New York that involved focusing on successful research practice policy partnerships, some of which involve people you're probably familiar with here in New York. The third having to do with the study that involved 340 clinics here in New York State that are supported by the Office of Mental Health. A study that I did in collaboration with Kimberly Hoagwood, my colleague who's now at NYU, used to be here at Columbia. And then finally, a study that was funded through the MacArthur Research Network on youth mental health that looked at, it was a randomized controlled trial of different forms of evidence-based practices for treating depression, anxiety, and behavioral health problems in 8 to 13-year-olds. So the first study, we called it the CAL-O, Cal for California, O for Ohio, and Dr. Lieberman made some reference about my not sounding like a Californian. Dude, you got to realize that this is NorCal, that's SoCal, and I'm strictly SoCal. But unless there are any other Californians in the audience, you probably wouldn't understand that. In any case, the objective of this study was to see whether or not community development teams had any impact on introducing an evidence-based practice at the county level. We began in California. We had 40 counties to work with. They were the counties in California that had not yet introduced this particular practice. And then we extended the study to include 11 counties in Ohio. We randomized them in a process known as rolling randomization. So it's very difficult to train the staff of child welfare or child mental health agencies from 40 counties simultaneously. It's a lot more manageable to break them up into smaller units. So they were broken up in California into 3 cohorts, and then 1 cohort in Ohio. And half of them were randomized to participate in these community development teams. The other half were randomized to getting exposed to the treatment as they normally would. They'd send their staff to be trained, they'd get some technical assistance and supervision, but they wouldn't necessarily bring stakeholders from different agencies and different counties together. So in this particular study, one of the questions that we were interested in looking at is to what extent is the networks that systems leaders participate in or belong to have any impact on their willingness to adopt an innovative practice. The social network literature in the field of prevention, for example, has numerous instances of where, depending upon who you tend to associate with, you may be more or less overweight. You may be more or less at risk for HIV or sexually transmitted diseases or drug use. Social networks play an important role in influencing and changing behavior. Well, it turns out it's not only influential in changing the behavior of individuals, but it's influential in changing the behavior of entire organizations. And what we found in our study was that indeed there were a variety of different networks, some of which were very small and isolated, some of which were highly interconnected. And we found that characteristics of those networks were independent predictors of the extent to which they were successful in implementing this treatment foster care Oregon. So that if you lived or worked in a large county, you were more likely to be successful in implementing. If you worked in an urban county, you were more likely to be successful, which makes much sense because they had more resources to put into it. Small rural counties frequently don't have enough people to be trained in an intervention. They don't have enough to pay the treatment developer. They have to pool resources so that those, you would naturally think would be associated. What was curious was that the measures of the extent to which people reach out to others for information and advice, or others reach to you for information and advice, was or was not associated with level of implementation. Now, you would think the more you get engaged in wanting to do something, the more effort you put into seeking information, right? I mean, that would make sense. But it turns out that the extent to which you reach out to others was not a significant predictor. Rather, the extent to which others reach out to you was. Now, why do you think that's the case? Well, the answer is, since time is short, because you're more successful at implementing. If you are already close to the latter part of that process, people come to you wanting information and advice. How did you do it? We want to see how it works in your county. So that the level of in-degree centrality was a significant independent predictor. Likewise, we found that the community development team did do what it was supposed to do, which was to build social networks. So that if you were in the experimental condition, participating in a community development team, you were linked to other community development teams in one big network. Whereas if you were in the control condition, you were more or less isolated. There was a significant difference in the number of components and the size and the structure of networks, depending upon whether you got the intervention that was designed to build social networks and to support them or not. We also found in talking to people that many of the characteristics associated with the standard frameworks for implementation also seemed to predict the extent to which people interacted with one another. So if there was funding to support a new program, that brought people together. If there was a mandate to require a program. New York State, for example, has a number of mandates for how services to children and adolescents and mental health services get delivered. Unfortunately, a lot of them are unfunded mandates, which forces agencies to scramble to figure out how am I going to get the resources to successfully implement this practice. So many times not having funding can bring people together. The size of the county, having the same clients. So if you are a child welfare system, you're likely to collaborate with the juvenile justice system because you see many of the same clients. And likewise, you see many of the same clients in the mental health care system as well. And then characteristics of the agencies themselves. The field of implementation science has devoted a lot of energy to understanding the extent to which the interorganizational culture contributes to the likelihood of successfully adopting a program. But it's not just the culture of the organizations, but it's the culture of the collaboration that seems to be important as well. And then the characteristics of the individual actors. So all of these help determine what the focus of the collaboration is likely to be, whether or not it's a formal collaboration established through an MOU or merely an informal agreements among systems leaders, and how often that collaboration actually gets together. These, in turn, seem to be related to the structure of the social networks as well as the stage of implementation. So that was one study. The next study looked at the use of research evidence. So we know that research evidence is what creates an evidence-based practice. But what we don't know is the extent to which the people who make the decisions whether or not to use an evidence-based practice actually even look at the evidence. And so we wanted to know how policymakers accessed, evaluated, and applied evidence in their decisions whether or not to implement a new practice. And what we found is that the extent to which a system leader acquired information, which we referred to as input, was a significant independent predictor of how far they got with respect to implementing a new practice. It also significantly predicted the number of activities that they engaged in during the implementation phase, as well as the sustainment phase. Process was marginally associated with the pre-implementation and implementation phase activities. Output didn't seem to be related at all. And output refers to once you've got the research evidence, how do you apply it? In many instances, they make the decision not to apply it at all, but rather to ignore the evidence because they've got other things to worry about. But nevertheless, total engagement was a significant predictor of the furthest stage that they reached, as well as the proportion of activities in the latter two phases of implementation. Now, that's what we learned from the quantitative survey that we administered to the participants in the CalO study. But we also learned that there are other types of new practice. Evidence of the resources necessary to acquire that evidence, for example. It costs money to interact with an intermediary organization, to hire a consultant, to go to a conference. And that's typically where they hear about many of these new practices. Evidence of the demand. If they don't think the kids in their county need this particular practice, they're not interested, no matter what the evidence. And then finally, personalized evidence. Does it resonate with your own clinical or administrative experience? If it doesn't, then I don't care what kind of p-value it has or what the sample size is, I'm not going to touch it. So the use of research evidence is important. The third is the models of evidence. So you could consider a randomized controlled trial of a particular practice ideally should be generalizable. If it works here in New York, it should work in LA or Chicago. If it works with 8 to 13-year-old Spanish-speaking Latino kids, it should work with 8 to 13-year-old African Americans. That's the global perspective on evidence. It's based on standards of scientific rigor. It gives emphasis to generalizability or transferability of findings from one region to another, one population to another. But there's another form of evidence, which we call local evidence. It's internal. It originates within an organization. Oftentimes includes their own administrative data. It's based on personal experience, and it emphasizes the uniqueness of the population that they work with. So the kids in New York may look like the kids in California, but they're not, is what you may hear. So to look at that, we evaluated a sample of the 346 clinics in New York State. And we wanted to understand a perspective of agency CEOs and clinical directors as to what they imagine to be barriers to adopting innovative practices and the factors that promoted that. So this was a qualitative study where we interviewed, I think it was 75 agency and program directors, and we stratified that sample based on how engaged they were in learning about these innovative practices. Did they not answer when we invited them to engage in a training? Did they participate in a webinar? Did they go to an in-person training, or did they participate in a learning collaborative? And what we found was a certain list of barriers as well as facilitators to adopting an innovative practice. It turns out that the barriers came to three specific categories: cost, capacity, and acceptability. In the end, it turns out that most decision makers in deciding whether to adopt a new evidence-based practice want answers to three questions. What's it going to cost me? Can I do it? Do I really want to do it? And wanting to do it is not just a matter of, does the agency want to do it? Do the staff want to do it? Do they want to learn something new after having done the same thing for the last 30 years? Do the clients want to do it? Are they in favor of it? So we found that not only do they boil down all of the lists that are contained in these implementation frameworks to cost, capacity, and acceptability, but when making the decisions, they engage in what has now popularly been called behavioral economics, where people are essentially being more concerned with how is it going to impact them now rather than later, or temporal discounting, avoiding any sort of risk or loss aversion, using rules of thumb to make decisions, like my staff aren't going to go for it, without even asking the staff whether they want to do it or not. Decision fatigue, preferring a mandate even if it's unfunded because you don't have to make the decision. Somebody else made it for you. Or how the choices are framed by, say, OMH. And then whether or not those choices can be manipulated. So for example, if your competitor in the city where you deliver services is doing the practice, you're more inclined to do it as well. So these practices, we found evidence of all of these practices being exercised in the process of making decisions, whether or not to adopt innovative practices. The fourth element are the partnerships. So research practice partnerships are an important strategy for reducing that gap between research and or translation, research and practice. The problem, though, is that some work better than others. And we really don't have a good handle on what constitutes a successful partnership. So we looked at three models of successful partnership. One that was based in San Diego, California, between the Child and Adolescent Services Research Center and two San Diego County agencies, Behavioral Health Services and Child Welfare. The second between New York City's Administration for Children's Services and the Oregon Social Learning Center. And then the third between Kimberly Hoagwood and her group at NYU and the New York State Office of Mental Health. And what we found is that successful partnerships exist on a continuum. There is no one model of success when it comes to bringing researchers, policymakers, and practitioners together. And that model is focused on the leadership. So there are going to be times when the researcher assumes leadership. There are going to be times when the policymaker or practitioner assumes leadership. The focus of the partnership, whether it's to generate knowledge through NIH-funded research grants, or to disseminate that knowledge through training programs. And then the activities involved, whether it's to conduct research and all partners are engaged, or to provide technical assistance. To have a successful partnership, there are a number of common elements, which include interpersonal characteristics, trust, commitment, openness, honesty, interpersonal characteristics like communication, organizational characteristics like a clear division of roles and responsibilities, and environmental characteristics that include funding and availability of resources. And then finally, a set of cultural characteristics. So what are the rules of engagement? What is acceptable forms of demands that one places on the partner, and what's unacceptable? So that leads us to the last element, and that is the cultural exchanges. And we looked at this cultural exchange in the context of this MacArthur-funded study. We wanted to look at whether or not, when compared to usual care, a standard manualized approach to treatment, which is what most people are trained in doing, is as effective or more effective than a modular approach. Modular being, rather than go through the entire collection of modules in an intervention, that one can pick and choose based on an algorithm which is framed around the needs of the client. And the belief was that the modular version would be effective because that's what clinicians typically do. They rarely go through an entire 12-week course of CBT because there simply isn't enough time and resources to do it. And in fact, most clients don't have just one mental health problem. They usually have a number of comorbid conditions. So what the clinical trial found was that the modular condition was the most effective in reducing symptoms. It was even more effective than the standardized manual approach. And it was kind of surprising that the standardized wasn't that different than usual care. But the modular was significantly better than either of those. The question is why? What is it about the modular? Well, initially we looked at the process of implementation of these three evidence-based practices. And one of the things that we learned was the interactions that occurred between the researchers and the clinicians in the community clinics, and this was a study done in Honolulu and Boston, was important in determining whether or not a clinician was going to continue to use these evidence-based practices. And in fact, we found 3 months after we did the study, and it concluded, that about over 90% of them continue to use some form of these evidence-based practices. So even though the clinical trial ended, they were continuing to use them, but most of them were using a modular version, even if they were trained in the standard manualized approach. So the reason why, when we asked them about it, was that it enabled more of an exchange between the practitioners and the researchers. And the practitioners really liked that. They felt like they were making a contribution not just to the study, but to the education of the researchers, that they were influencing how they viewed this process. And in fact, the managing and adapting practice that Bruce Chorpita has developed is a direct outgrowth of this. So that exchange of ideas between the researcher and the practitioner had a big impact on the outcome. So we call this cultural exchange, and it's a process by which people who belong to different cultural systems, whether they're organizational cultures like research and practice or national cultures, go through a process of assessing one another's culture, relying on communication, to beginning to accommodate to those differences in culture through collaboration, and then integrating cultures through compromise. We found that also to be predictive of stage of implementation. So the greater engagement and exchange of knowledge, attitudes, and behaviors, the greater the positive outcomes. So we found basically it boils down to relationships and to shared understandings. And these are the themes that unite all 5 of these components to implementation. So the extent to which there are productive relationships between all of the stakeholders involved, the extent to which there are shared understandings that provide models of as well as models for these relationships seem to be associated with successful implementation. So this is the transactional model that has essentially brought all of these components together, that focus on the characteristics that one finds in traditional frameworks, that focuses on both the structure and the process of these relationships, the outcomes in terms of the cultural systems that emerge from those relationships, and then the outcomes of implementation. So I'll just finish up by saying that the implications for implementation science is that this highlights relationships and cultural exchanges that can create opportunities for striking balance between some of the classic oppositions in the field. The opposition between fidelity to an intervention and adapting it to a particular setting, between internal and external validity, between global and local evidence. It also has implications for incorporating relationship building and social networking interventions in strategies that are designed to facilitate implementation, developing new tools for assessment of the process and outcomes of cultural exchange, and then integrating that transaction into other existing dissemination implementation theories and models. And then finally, in terms of policy and practice, it provides a better understanding of how to build and sustain effective relationships, how to use research evidence in policy and practice, and how to facilitate implementation by integrating global and local models through research practice policy partnerships. So I'll end there and take questions.
Well, thank you very much for that very detailed and informative presentation. So implementation science, so you used to think that if you build a better mousetrap, the world will be a path to your door. And then we did the Katie study, and nobody paid any attention to it, didn't have any impact on practice. So you could say, well, that evidence needs to be implemented better. Question is sort of how do you do that? And that's a lot of what your presentation was. It seems like there's sort of 2 components. One is how do you take research evidence that can be rendered in the way of clinical or therapeutic services and have it adopted in a way that's faithful to the nature of the model of care. And then the second thing is almost a program evaluation. In other words, how effectively is it being done? These models that you're describing as a way of doing it, I guess, we're aware as clinicians of the challenge in trying to implement the latest findings, things in an evidence-based way, is a way that's fidelity. But this, to a large degree, in our clinical world, and I'm sort of removed from it, so I may not be the best, the most informed on it, is something that we don't experience in any substantial way other than regulatory bodies or financing systems. So that's my 20,000-foot impression, but we have some people who actually have some expertise in it, so I'd like to ask them to comment on this just by way of getting the discussion started. So, Lisa, I can see you raising your hand and chomping at the bit.
spinning. Oh, my head is spinning, and I don't mean to
Well,
be.
my job is done.
So I'm trying, I think that as someone who's sort of between a clinical health services researcher who's done sort of randomized trials of, clinical interventions, and sort of now someone who's working very much in the real world, and just to put a plug in 2 weeks, I'm going to be doing grand rounds, and I'm going to be focusing on the Center for Practice Innovations, which is sort of the adult version of what Kimberly does. So I was like very excited to sort of have you lay the foundation for my talk. But I guess the thing that always happens to me when I sort of dive into implementation science is that there's just so many concepts and so many kind of dimensions and domains, and sort of trying to wrap my head around it in such a way that I can sort of make it real. And so I guess let me kind of ask you what you would do faced with the challenge that I have. Okay, so the state says to the Center for Practice Innovations, which I oversee and where Sapana works, okay, well, we're going to give you a certain amount of money to make sure that individual placement and support, which is a supported employment model, gets done properly. Okay, go for it. We're going to fund one supported employment specialist at each of 70 PROS programs in the state, and that's kind of like ready, get set, go. So, and I know how we've sort of thought about it, but I'm kind of interested in how, you would approach that. And the state doesn't want us to take a year to do this. Like, they're like, what happened yesterday? Okay. And so just sort of maybe how you would approach that.
Well, certainly, what I've seen has been standard practice is that people will focus on a particular facet of the problem and mount all of their energies in addressing that facet. So, for example, with supportive employment, I can imagine one of the biggest challenges is getting everybody on board with the concept. And that means not only providing a certain level of understanding about how the program operates, why it operates the way that it does, what its intended outcomes look like, but also how and what changes in their own day-to-day processes or operations need to be made in order to successfully integrate supportive employment into their programs. And so some people will focus on the organizational settings. Can you create an organizational culture that values supportive employment, or that gives priority to that, even if it means taking time and effort away from delivering other services. Others will focus on leadership. So Greg Ahrens, for example, has now developed a number of interventions which are designed to support leaders in getting their agencies to adopt these programs, in the belief that leaders matter, and if a leader is not supportive, it's not going to go anywhere. And you in your situation could take any one of those pieces of the bigger picture and focus on that, and hope that by successfully tackling that one aspect of the problem, you're going to achieve a successful outcome. And I think part of the problem has been that we've taken a piecemeal approach to implementation in the past, and consequently our record of success has been somewhat limited because of that. Now, in my case, I focused on relationships and understandings for a couple of reasons. One, it obviously reflects my own academic training, but it also reflects my experience in talking to practitioners. So that map of California that I was showing you earlier, as part of that project, I drove around the state talking to child mental health directors, child welfare directors, and listening to their experiences and working with researchers and why they were gun shy in terms of adopting innovative practices in some instances, but willing to do so in others. And what I learned from that experience was that they place a great deal of faith in their colleagues. The county, child welfare director in the next county, so that it really helped to give context and flesh to the social network data that I was collecting. And even though quality, or what are known as learning collaboratives, has been widely used, in fact, they're very popular here in New York State, it still has yet to be demonstrated that they produce an effective outcome. Yet, intuitively, people continue to rely on strategies like that because they see, A, there being strength in numbers, and they see the ability to marshal resources that you alone, are unable to provide. So in the sense of the challenge that you're facing, it's not a matter of every single relationship you build with all 70 or 80 of those programs, but it's how you begin to engage them as a collective, and that way make your job a little easier on the one hand, but also potentially create a better environment for them to adopt a program like yours.
Milton.
Thank you. It was wonderful. And, I think that the difficulty for many of us is that when we're trained on the one-on-one. We assess you, we diagnose you, and we have a treatment for you. And we don't think in the global picture that a system has to figure that out. And I always love when, the divide between qualitative and quantitative, right? We're so eager to do quantitative research to show efficacy and effectiveness. But wouldn't it have been wonderful if in the Katie study would have had some qualitative portion that would have helped you understand better the adoption or not? And if you do not include that, which could be a hybrid design where you include implementation and effectiveness at the same time, then you also get a sense of not only of who used it and the outcome, but why. Why it went that way, why it didn't go the other way, and we would understand the mentality of the people who are prescribing it and of the people who are taking it, who choose not to anymore, et cetera, besides what we tend to look at, which is side effects and, outcomes, which is beautiful. And the reality is that if you think about it, we all started with qualitative research, because how do you define an illness? You first look at the qualitative presentation, and then you say, oh, we need to measure hallucinations. And then we come up with quantitative measures that we create to validate what we clinically saw at the beginning, that we had no idea what exactly meant. So the reality is that all of you who are quantitative researchers, you actually are qualitative researchers to begin with, but you forget that you started that way. And I think that the issue that you were talking about to Lisa is, how do we make, there's a plethora of things to look at. And we need to start in the most poignant ones that the system where you're working with, the local and the global, can be interested in looking at, because you can look at 20 million things and maybe all of them are valuable. But it is very important to look at them, at the ones that the group that you're working with is interested in looking at, because otherwise you're missing the point. And I know that I'm making comments more than asking a question. I love the idea of social network analysis, and the way that I tend to look at is the drug dealer who is right next to the high school, just looking at the kids playing in the basketball court, and the drug dealer looks at, everybody talks to Melissa, so I need to engage Melissa. If I engage Melissa, I'm going to give her drugs for free. First, I'm going to get her to be with me. And then once Melissa's in my part, the 20 other kids that talk to Melissa, they're going to buy from her. So she is definitely a center. And in our way of looking at mental health and providing services, we never think that way. Obviously, we don't want to sell drug dealers, but the idea is, how do you make sure that you create a system that does what they need to do with the good drugs, not with the bad ones? So I don't know if you want to
Well, the same is true with respect to implementing evidence-based practices in agencies. So in California, people always look to the agencies in Orange County because they're, it has the reputation of being early adopters for anything and everything. And if you want to know how to adopt, whether it's in a healthcare setting, whether it's in a social service setting, if you want to know how to do it right, you go to Orange County. They've acquired that reputation. I'm sure there are clinics here in New York State that have a similar reputation that people regard as early adopters, and that the diffusion of innovation theory would also support that notion that these people, it's not just the person who's introducing it, it's the people who take it on initially who perhaps have even a greater impact on its dissemination as well. Sorry about that, and I forgot, I even saw your sign.
It's the Californians. Sapana?
Yeah, so I just wanted to make a comment between what Lisa has said and what Milton has said, and I think you touch on this, Larry, and thank you for your presentation, is that stakeholder involvement is very important early and often, and it can make the difference in sort of learning about, if we think about from T1 to T4 and the translational pipeline, the extent to which you involve stakeholders early, you can really start to design your intervention while you're thinking about external validity along the way. And I just wondered, I think what Lisa was pointing out in her comment about what we are charged with doing at the Center for Practice Innovations is, if you were to think about prioritizing, a focus, part of what I hear you saying is that some of that comes from what you believe in your training, but part of that comes from perhaps the intervention you're trying to disseminate. How do you make a decision? How do you make the decision of, what to focus on? And should stakeholders always be primary?
Well, so again, the heart and soul of this transactional model is negotiation and compromise. I mean, we've been trained as researchers, we've been given a certain worldview that says we have the knowledge, we have the tools, to build the $6 million intervention. And that's our responsibility. Their responsibility is to be the recipient, the user of these tools. And the fact is that in a way that kind of discounts all of the clinical experience, it's a potential resource that goes wasted, basically. And being in a school of social work, a discipline whose field is all about social justice and empowerment, oftentimes you hear the term co-creation, where the different stakeholders participate in the development of treatment, the development of prevention interventions. Well, there's enormous potential in doing that, but there are certain challenges in doing that. If you don't have a partner that's good to work with, it can be a real pain in the ass, frankly. And some partnerships can develop instantly and progress for generations. Others take years to develop simply because of a sense of mistrust among the different partners. So it is important to consider the local models that I described. It's a valuable source of data, but it also is, a source that perhaps needs more rigor than it has been given in the past. Practice-based evidence is something you hear clinicians talking about all the time, but that may mean something different for every single practitioner. So how do you establish some sort of consistency or uniformity in data collection and interpretation? And how do you integrate it with the models or the techniques that we as researchers are trained with? So rather than say the policymaker or the practitioner always has priority, I'm more inclined to say that each of them has an important role to play, but that who takes priority may change depending upon the setting, the context, and the issue being addressed. And that was really what I was trying to illustrate in that diagram illustrating successful partnerships. Sometimes you as the researcher have to take priority. Sometimes the practitioner and the policymaker has to take priority. But that in the end, it has to be, a process where debate and compromise are permissible. There is no one right answer. Now, of course, in times like this, when we live in a climate where, opinions have moved to extremes and that middle ground seems to be rapidly eroding, it may be an outdated notion. But as I said, every time I've engaged with policymakers and practitioners, it seems to be a perspective that resonates well. And it's being able to talk their language. So I'm not a social worker, but the number of times that I've told people who run these agencies that I'm not has generated surprise because I've learned the language. I've learned how to talk, and I've learned how to listen, and that is what has made the difference.
Sounds like there's a fair amount of diplomacy that's involved too.
Yes.
Scott?
Yeah. Thank you for the overview and dive into implementation science. You actually presented several different research studies in there, and there's one I have a question about. As a lot of us in here try to generate evidence to get it implemented, and you'd had that one slide about what made policymakers implement. How did they use evidence to decide to implement a policy? And it was about inputs and outputs. I didn't quite understand the slide. Could you explain a little more on the implications of that?
Actually, that comes out of a classic information processing model. You learn about that in Computer Science 101. When thinking about any information, you have to think about where it comes from, the input, and where it goes, its output. And in between that, the black box has always been the process. So something happens to that information between the point at which it enters into a system and when it leaves the system. In the case of most service system agencies, that process involves how people think about the evidence. How do they assess reliability? Or validity. Many times, in fact, when we asked child welfare system directors or county mental health system directors, so, how do you think about this evidence? How do you know it's really good? And they'll talk about things like, well, if it's in a manual, it's got to be evidence-based. Some of the comments that we got were really off the way. It certainly didn't resonate with what a researcher understands as being evidence-based. But consistently, we heard about their views of reliability, validity, and most importantly, relevance to their patient population. And then in terms of how they apply that evidence. So many times they will take evidence and then compare programs using that evidence in deciding which program to adopt. Sometimes they're concerned about whether or not programs are actually harmful or not effective, in which case they'll access the evidence. And, the fact is, a lot of the services that we deliver to kids are not evidence-based. Yet, for a variety of reasons, we have continued to deliver those services out of tradition, out of convenience, and so forth. So they may, as the output, apply that evidence in making those decisions. And then sometimes the output is to ignore the evidence simply because it's not feasible, they don't have the staff, they don't have the money, and it doesn't resonate with their clinical experience. So that's those three components to the use of research evidence.
And what in the research, it seemed like you said the output model, there was no significant finding. It sounded like you were saying that ultimately they generally ignored the evidence.
Well, what it demonstrates, the output separately, from the input in the process seemed to be not significantly predictive, which means that how they applied the evidence wasn't relevant in this particular case. And part of it may have been that in the context of this randomized controlled trial, where they are being provided with the evidence, they engage in activities to supplement what they're being provided. They make evaluations as to how relevant this new treatment foster care Oregon is to the kids in their county, that those would be higher on their list of priorities of use of research evidence than actually saying, well, I want to compare this to something else. Well, they've already made the commitment to participate in this randomized controlled trial. And the extent to which they do that may be more a reflection of how energized they were in acquiring the information and evaluating it than in applying it in the decisions on how to implement.
So I guess it's like everybody's entitled to their own opinion, but you're not entitled to your own evidence. Well, thank you for that interesting presentation and discussion, and everybody's invited to lunch upstairs to continue the discussion.